Today we're going to look at Chapter 15, what it was like to live in America during World War II. Now, during World War II, America totally mobilized for war. Unlike any other war in U.S. history, Americans were totally involved in the war. The wartime economy brought an end to the Great Depression. American industry switched to war production, building war materials, tanks, planes, guns, etc. There was no production of cars or appliances. You could not buy a new Ford during this time. Before Pearl Harbor, the American military was small, about the size of the military of Romania. But during the war, over 16 million served, about 11% of the population, and over 400,000 died during the war. Later, these men and women were called the greatest generation. Now, the culture in America during World War II. Movies, well, millions still loved to go to movies. And there were still escapist movies. Forget the war. Movies like Citizen Kane and The Maltese Falcon. But there was also patriotic movies to inspire Americans, like Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart. And funny movies that spoofed the Nazis. Charlie Chaplin's famous movie, The Great Dictator. Even Disney produced movies as propaganda. Here we see Mickey and Minnie and the Disney characters with their ration books. And Donald Duck reading Mein Kampf. And this was a famous movie showing what life was like for German children, one in particular, growing up in Germany, to show how bad it was. Music. Musicians entertained the troops overseas. Big band music was still very popular. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey. Bing Crosby's White Christmas, which came out in 1942, was very popular with the soldiers. The British singer Vera Lynn's White Cliffs of Dover was another famous World War II song. And of course, the Andrews Sisters, whose famous Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy was very popular among the soldiers. Sports changes like never before. Athletes from the major sports enlisted in the military. Ted Williams, the top home run hitter for the Boston Red Sox, became a U.S. Marine pilot. That's him there, second from the left. There was the All-American Girls Baseball League, which was featured in the hit movie with Tom Hanks, A League of Their Own. Players who could not serve in the military, they were either too old, too young, or even missing an arm, joined Major League Baseball. This is Pete Gray of the St. Louis Browns, who did not have a right arm. Movie stars also enlisted in the military. Some entertained the troops. There we see Bob Hope. Some fought in combat. So we Clark Gable here from the famous movie Gone with the Wind, who was in the United States Army Air Force. And we have Jimmy Stewart, famous movie here, It's a Wonderful Life, became a bomber pilot, flew 25 missions over Europe. Henry Fonda from The Grapes of Wrath joined the United States Navy. Another aspect of life in America during the Second World War was rationing. The war caused shortages of everything. There was a need by the military, or simply the supplies were cut off from a country that we used to get the supplies from. For example, we used to import a lot of sugar from the Philippines, but once the Japanese occupied the Philippine Islands, obviously that supply got cut off. So a system of rationing was instituted. They rationed everything: sugar, coffee, meat, butter. Every family, based on how many people you had in your family, got ration coupons. And you would use them when you went to the store. You still had to pay for them, but you also had to have enough ration points to be able to get what you want. Clothing was rationed, as was gasoline. Americans hated gasoline rationing. Most people got an A sticker, which was what average people would get, and that allowed you to have 4 gallons a week. Now, to think about that, your average car back then got 20 miles to the gallon, so that was about 80 miles you could drive per week. People who had specialized jobs, engineers, factory workers, doctors got better stickers, so they can get more gas, but your average American got 4 gallons a week. You can see the woman pointing to her car here. Another thing, too, is we needed chrome for building weapons. So cars didn't have those chrome bumpers like they were famously had back in the 1940s, but they were replaced with wooden bumpers. And for those who were very upset, they would use guilt. Here we see a burning Allied tanker, and the quote, "Should brave men die so you could drive?" So the government would guilt you into not driving. There were also drives to collect needed materials, like we do clothing drives and toy drives. They would have scrap metal drives, rubber drives, paper drives, things to get stuff that could be reused into the military. And even victory gardens. People would grow vegetable gardens in their backyards, their front yards, because vegetables weren't always readily available. War production. Every year, the U.S. raised its production goals, and each year met them. By the middle of 1945, the last year of the war, the U.S. produced 300,000 airplanes, 100,000 tanks, 6 million rifles, and so on. Everything from helmets to belt buckles. Many men went off to war, so women took their place in the factories. Women worked in the defense industry. This led to the famous person called Rosie the Riveter. How women would go off to the factory, taking the place of men, and produce the war materials needed to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese. And financing the war. Wars are expensive. Government spending went up. $8.9 billion in 1939 to $95 billion in 1945. So the government sold war bonds to finance the war, and everyone was encouraged to buy war bonds. You go to a movie, and at the very end, they would say war bonds on sale in the lobby. Now, this would cause a huge national debt, but people were encouraged. Don't let that shadow touch them. Your little American children with the shadow of the swastika. Or before it's too late and German bombers are flying over America, buy war bonds. Or my favorite patriotic one, there's Uncle Sam leading the troops forward, and we have to buy war bonds to, keep the troops going. Now, there was a dark side of World War II, which we have to talk about. Now, obviously, because of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans suffered the worst discrimination of the war. American military leaders were worried that Japanese Americans living on the West Coast might be spies for Japan. There was a lot of hostility towards the Japanese because of Pearl Harbor. This was a Japanese store owner in Seattle trying to tell everyone that he was still an American citizen. Many of these Japanese were born here. February 19th, 1942, FDR signs an order removing all Japanese Americans. These are U.S.-born Americans, citizens of the United States, who happen to be of Japanese descent, and they had to leave the West Coast. These things would be put up in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington. The families had to pack up some belongings, and they'd be shipped to these concentration camps. 110,000 people of Japanese heritage were sent to these internment camps in remote areas in the West. They arrived by bus and train, lots of soldiers there, quite intimidating. They would have wooden barracks. You can see here, this is where the Japanese Americans would live during the war. They'd be surrounded by barbed wire. It wasn't electrified, obviously, but it was meant to keep them in. They had large communal dining halls. Now, many lost all their possessions. They had to give up their cars, their homes, their stores, and they did not get them back after the war was over. Now, up to 20,000 Japanese Americans fought in the U.S. military in Italy. I mentioned this during our Italian campaign. While their parents were sitting in these internment camps, they went off to fight in the war. Now, the United States military didn't trust them to fight against the Japanese, so they sent them to Italy. In 1988, Congress voted to pay $20,000 to each of the surviving Americans of Japanese descent who were interned during World War II. Now I'm going to talk about the segregation in the military. Now, since the Civil War, African Americans served in the military, but in segregated units. Many of you may have seen the famous movie Glory with Denzel Washington about the fighting of a Massachusetts regiment in the Civil War made up of all black soldiers but with white officers. Nothing had changed since the Civil War. During World War II, African Americans' enlistment was at an all-time high. More than 1 million blacks served in the armed forces. However, the U.S. military was still heavily segregated. The U.S. Army allowed blacks to serve, but in segregated units. The U.S. Navy only allowed blacks to serve as waiters and busboys, what they called steward's mates, on board naval ships. And the U.S. Marines did not allow blacks to enlist at first. As the war progressed and the need for manpower grew, the U.S. military had to change. Now, we'll start with the Army. During World War II, most African American soldiers served only as truck drivers. In October 25th of 1940, before the war, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. became the first African American general in the United States Army. And he pushed to integrate Army units, though it didn't happen while he was during the Second World War. He was so famous that they actually issued a stamp in his honor. The 761st Tank Battalion became the first black tank battalion. They fought in Europe. They were called the Black Panthers. They were assigned to General George Patton's Third Army at his request. And they even fought at the Battle of the Bulge, which we'll talk about in the future. Jackie Robinson, the famous star of the Brooklyn Dodgers who broke the color line, was actually a member of the Tank Battalion, but the war ended before he was transferred to Europe. The 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers Division, we already mentioned them fighting in Italy. They were the only black infantry division to see combat in Europe. They served in the Italian campaign, as I mentioned earlier, in 1944 to the war's end. 2 soldiers would receive the Medal of Honor, but not until 1997. The most famous unit in the of African Americans in the United States military were the Tuskegee Airmen. These were the first African American military pilots. They formed the 332nd Fighter Group that fought first in North Africa and later in Italy. They were led by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of General Davis, Sr. While in Italy, they flew the brand new P-51 fighters. They painted the tails of their fighters red, thus they were known as Red Tails. They've made 2 movies about them, one called The Red Tails, and the other one, which I'm really not a big fan of, the other one, which was really good, was Tuskegee Airmen, starring Lawrence Fishburne and Cuba Gooding Jr. They flew bomber missions, bomber escort missions, and in their 1,578 combat missions, they shot down over 100 German planes. In fact, it was members of the Tuskegee Airmen that shot down the first German jet fighter. And in all their escort duty, they never lost a bomber to enemy action. Davis will become the first African-American general in the United States Air Force in 1954. Now we're going to talk about the U.S. Navy. Pictured here is Doris Miller, who went by the nickname Dory. He was born in Texas and he enlisted in the United States Navy before World War II. Since he was black, he was only allowed to be a mess attendant. He was stationed on board the USS West Virginia, which was stationed in Pearl Harbor. And during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, having no prior training in using this weapon, he manned an anti-aircraft gun and fired at Japanese planes. He also helped carry the mortally wounded captain of the USS West Virginia out of harm's way. Miller was recognized as one of the first U.S. heroes of the World War II and was awarded the Navy Cross by Admiral Nimitz. The photograph here shows Nimitz placing the Navy Cross on Miller on board the USS Enterprise. Coincidentally, Nimitz was also from Texas. Nimitz said of Miller, "This marks the first time in the conflict that such a high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, and I'm sure that future will see others similarly honored for brave acts." This is a recruitment poster to get other blacks to join the Navy during World War II. Sadly, Miller died in the war in 1943 on the aircraft carrier he was stationed on. A Japanese submarine torpedoed it in the middle of the night. It sank, taking down over half the crew, including Miller. Recently, the United States Navy has announced that they're going to name an aircraft carrier, which are usually named after presidents or very important people in the government. The new aircraft carrier will be named after Doris Miller. Now, after Pearl Harbor, the Navy started to allow African Americans to serve in positions of authority, officers, that is. In 1944, the Navy commissioned 2 ships with predominantly black crews. Also that year, the Golden 13 became the Navy's first African American commissioned officers. Here's a photograph of them. Samuel L. Gravely Jr. becomes an officer, and after World War II, he'll become the first black ship captain. And in 1971, he'll become the first black Navy admiral. Now, the United States Marine Corps did not want black Marines, but Franklin Roosevelt pushed for it. And on June 1st, 1942, the first group of black U.S. Marine Corps recruits was admitted. Blacks were formed into defense units and sent to the Pacific, and they proved themselves in combat, especially at the Battle of Saipan. Following the June 1944 Battle of Saipan, the United States Marine Corps General Alexander Vandergrift, probably the most famous Marine in World War II, instead of the performance of the all-black 3rd Marine Ammunition Company, the Negro Marines are no longer on trial. They are Marines, period. Here's a picture of some of the Marines on Saipan. "125,000 African Americans were sent overseas in World War II. 708 were killed in action. No African American was awarded a Medal of Honor either during World War II or immediately afterwards. On January 13, 1997, more than 50 years after the end of the war, President Bill Clinton awarded the medal to 7 African American World War II veterans. The only living recipient was Verner Baker of the 92nd Infantry Division." Here we see Clinton awarding Baker the medal. Baker was awarded the medal for his actions on April 5th and 6th, 1945 in Italy. He died back in 2010 at the age of 90. All right, this concludes our section on American life in World War II. I hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something from it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.